Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Barwon Health Foundation, my name is Francis Trainor, and we thank you all for joining us today for our third of our series of Legacy Month webinars. Unfortunately, Jack Airby, who usually joins us, can't be with us this afternoon, but as many of you would know, Jack had previously given me strict instructions to play some music while we're waiting for these webinars to start, and I hope you all had a guess at trying to name that tune. I did mention to our panelists that we were going to be playing something, and Paul Lightfoot did jump out of the box with a name, but I'm not saying you're 100% correct, Paul. It was actually the American composer Aaron Copland, who was inspired to write his fanfare for the common man, which you did say, by a World War II wartime speech rallying Americans against imperialism. But what I was really looking for, and some of you might remember, that the opening bars were used every Thursday night on league teams in the 70s and 80s with Lou Richards, Jack Dyer, Geelong's own, the great Bobby Davis. And finally, others might remember that an updated version by Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which we just played just then, was also the theme music for the Australian television coverage of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. And of course, we hope the Olympics start tomorrow in Tokyo. Well, we certainly don't have any common men with us today, so enough of the trivia, and let's get on with this afternoon's webinar. Please let me start with the Acknowledgement of Country. We, the Barwon Health Foundation, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to the elders, both past and present. We thank the traditional owners for the custodianship of the land and celebrate the continuing culture of the Wadawurrung people, acknowledging the memory of honourable ancestors. We also welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us for this webinar this afternoon. So welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, to Barwon Health Foundation's Legacy Month and to our webinar this afternoon. And on behalf of the Foundation, we certainly hope you're all coping as well as you can with the current lockdown. Welcome to those of you who are joining us live and all those who are viewing this as a replay at some time in the future. Today is being run as a webinar, so you can only see myself and our special guests. We can't see you, but you'll be able to participate. We encourage that by clicking on the chat box towards the bottom of your Zoom screen and typing in your question. And subject to time, we'll try and unmute you and get your question for our guests. So those of you who may have joined us in past webinars, you'll be familiar that this year we're discussing legacy, leadership, and this week, amazing clinical trials. And I'm really looking forward to today with our special guests, prominent Geelong businessman and philanthropist, the wonderful Robert Costa, and Paul Lightfoot, the inaugural director of the Adrian Costa Clinical Trial Centre. Welcome to both of you. We'll be getting to you shortly. So as you know, this is Legacy Month, which is time for us all to celebrate life and to reflect on the legacy we're leaving or will leave when we depart this life. Our legacy is how we wish to be remembered and an opportunity to show appreciation and a lasting impact on what we see as important. As the lockdown in Victoria has been extended, it's again timely to reflect and get our affairs in order. In Australia, a staggering 60% of adults don't have a valid will, and it leaves a whole lot of complications. For some of us that do have wills, often they were done a long time ago. And as we know, circumstances change. What were priorities 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago may not be the same today. So even if you have a will prepared, it's always a good idea to review it, ensure it's valid, and make doubly sure that your wishes are recorded. An interesting statistic is that if people are asked if they wish to leave a gift in their will to a charitable cause, the numbers actually double. So I put that to everyone viewing the webinar today. If you haven't already considered leaving a gift to a charitable cause, please give it some thought. There are so many great charitable causes, but at Barwon Health Foundation, of course, we strongly believe there's no better cause than a consideration to giving the gift of good health, not the least reason being Geelong deserves the very best. And it really doesn't matter how large or small that gift may be. There are also, of course, living legacies. Now, these are donations made now that can be placed into an endowment as a name fund to provide a sustainable support for Barwon Health services in the future. And there are so many wonderful examples, including a great number of people who have purchased a leaf, either for themselves or in memory of a loved one, for $500, $1,000 or $2,000 on our lasting legacy tree, which has been established just alongside the main entrance to the hospital. There are so many great stories of giving. Amazing bequests like that of Beth Allerton, whose gratitude was a sizable bequest to our hospital as a gift for the community who supported her local business over many, many years. Some of you will remember Allerton shoes with a slogan of, "For women with discerning tastes." Beth Allerton's gift was directed to the Andrew Love Cancer Centre, and in gratitude, the oncology pharmacy is now named in honour of the Allerton family. Another wonderful bequest was that from a local pensioner, Archie Howard, who made a living as a concreter. Archie was a humble man who had decided that in leaving gifts to those that were close to him, that the hospital and the community were equally deserving of his bequest. Archie's legacy will care for patients and will save lives. And in terms of in memoriam gifts, no matter how large or small, they can make an enormous impact. And speaking of enormous impact, most of you will know that the enormous gift from the Costa Foundation in memory of the late Adrian Costa. The Costa family made an inspiring gift to our community, funding the establishment of regional Victoria's first medical research clinical trial centre at Barwon Health. The Adrian Costa Clinical Trial Centre, where research bridges the gap between what can be provided in regional Victoria with world-leading, life-saving and life-extending clinical trials. Quite extraordinary, and we'll be discussing all this with our guests today. Geelong Hospital was built on a legacy of giving from its early days in the 1840s, and if you'd like any more information on how you can make an impact, either right now or in the future, please give us a call at the Foundation. We'd be happy to have a confidential chat with you. And if you've already made a decision to support the Foundation with a gift, please give us a call to also learn more of the Tim Malloy Bequest Society. And also, I'd just like to let you all know that during Legacy Month, you can get your will written for free by one of our prominent local law firms who are donating their services for the good of the community. As I said earlier, we have two very special guests with us this afternoon. And as in previous weeks, with the short amount of time we have today, I already know we won't be able to do justice to both of them or to you who have tuned in. So I apologise in advance for that. I've said before that it would almost be impossible to imagine Geelong in some sliding door alternate reality universe without the Costa family. Such is their amazing contribution to sport, the arts, health, kids, the underprivileged, those with disabilities, victims of family violence, the list goes on and on. We've all seen the enormous progress the region has made in so many ways, from its metamorphosis of being a highly industrial region 30 plus years ago to now being a very sophisticated city and a hub for tourism, health, research and education, plus a lifestyle that's the envy of so many. Those who have driven that change and fostered the pride and spirit have been men and women of great foresight and passion for the region, demanding that Geelong deserves the very best. And the Costas, and particularly our guest, Robert Costa, has been very much at the forefront of that change. And if the Costas hadn't been in Geelong, Geelong simply would not be anywhere like it is today. So Robert Costa was a co-founder of the Costa Group, Australia's largest grower, marketer and exporter of fresh fruit and vegetables. Whilst Frank was the public face and of course a great leader, it was Robert's knowledge and of the commercial aspects of the horticultural industry and strong business acumen, which many would say was its absolute strength. Throughout the development years of the Costa Group, Robert managed the company's asset base and balance sheet, including working capital, liquidity and cash flow. This experience formed a strong knowledge base for his current position as chair of Costa Asset Management, a privately owned investment company that focuses on developing, managing and sustaining capital across a portfolio of agriculture, private equity and property assets. Robert's community service has been extensive. He was a former mayor of Geelong West. He's been called upon by both state and federal governments in the past to chair the area consultative committee set up by the federal government to ignite employment in the region, and chair of the Geelong Regional Innovation Investment Fund set up by the state and federal governments after the closure of Ford. He's also been a leading champion behind the Geelong Performing Arts upgrade, which is so important to the cultural richness of the region, and these are just a few. I read an article which described Robert, and I quote, "Robert, the other Costa, if you like, given Frank's high profile, is an affable bloke. He's dad to 5 adult children and grandfather to 15. He's well known in business circles, but somehow enjoys a happy knack flying under the radar while in plain view. He has a ready grin and a handshake, a slightly disarming Aussie vernacular, a relaxed demeanour, and a self-deprecating humour," end quote. So welcome, Robert Costa, and I'll be interested to see if we hear any of that slightly disarming Aussie vernacular over the next 20 minutes or so. Now, you've been described as being the son of a migrant greengrocer, which is quite factual, but goes nowhere near telling the full story of your family's association with land and produce. The story of the Costa family in Geelong goes a long way back, long way back. When I first met Robert, I had naively assumed that his parents may have migrated to Australia in the post-war 40s and 50s when lots of Italian immigrants came to our country, And I was surprised to learn from Rob that the Costa connection to Australia goes back before the turn of the century and involves quite a few twists and turns. A fuller story is truly fascinating, going right back to the mid-1700s, with Robert's great-great-great-grandfather, Gaetano Costa, leaving Portugal and making his way to Salina, a small island off the coast of Italy. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to tell the full amazing story today, but the key thread is that for generations, the Costas understood building a business. And just as importantly in their case, they also understood the land and horticulture and how to get the best from the soil, which is something that Robert, more than 250 years later, had a passion for and indeed excelled at as well. Which may just prove the old adage that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or the grape fall far from the vine, or avocados from whatever plant they grow on. It's impossible to do the full story justice in the time we have today, so we're fast forwarding 100 years from first establishing roots, if you'll pardon the pun, in Salina. And we move to Francesco Jr., who's Robert's grandfather. He was born in 1863 when his father, Francesco Sr., and if I'm getting my maths correct, and I'm pretty sure I am, was quite senior indeed to be changing nappies at 68 years of age. On his father's death, and still as a teenager, young Francesco inherited the business. And just like the generations of Costas before him, he worked hard, married Anna, and maintained a successful output from the vineyards and kept his overseas agents adequately supplied. But they hit a bit of a hurdle, Robert. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, well, in the 1880s, the phylloxera epidemic struck through southern Europe into all grapevines, and of course the family livelihood was based solely on wine grapes, grapevines on the hills in Salina. And as the phylloxera epidemic actually went through Geelong too, a bit later on, and cleaned out their Ballerine area, etc., and other areas. But if, for those who don't understand, it's akin to the potato blight in Ireland, that forced all the mass immigration from Ireland. So many from southern Europe, there was no livelihood left. So my grandfather came out to Australia with my oldest uncle. My father wasn't born at the time. My oldest two uncles to set up here in Australia, and grandfather stayed here until the boys, who were only 12 and 10 at the time, gave them a few years to get themselves established, and then he went back to Italy. And then, of course, the essence was he was working here in Australia to send money back to feed the family, but also to be able to save up enough to buy the new phylloxera-resistant rootstocks from the United States. And once he had those, then he went back home to recommence the vineyard. And then my dad was born in 1909, so almost like a bit of a second family. And then Dad came out to Australia in 1926 to join his older brothers.
He was quite a smart boy and was educated by the Franciscan priests in Italy, studying languages, mathematics, religion, and philosophy. And he was determined to go to university, but his parents had other ideas.
Well, his parents just couldn't afford to send him to university. That's what it was. I mean, and so Dad was given two options. He was given to either join the priesthood, which is a great honour in, of course, back in those days in Italy, to have a son in the priesthood, or come out to Australia to join his brothers. And I, for one, am glad he chose the latter option.
I bet. So he eventually settled in Geelong, married your mother, Mary, in 1936, St Mary's. And sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, he started with his brothers first, and then he broke out on his own, and he had a fruit shop in Warrnambool, and a store. So he had a couple of different places he'd been, and then he came back to Geelong, and that's when he married and settled down.
And the shop in Moorabool Street. So your grandfather Francesco was actually worked there at one stage, and then in the 1890s.
He did. Yeah, my father bought it from him in 1934. Didn't buy it from him, of course. Bought it from my mum's uncle, who actually owned it at the time, Mr. Vigona, and so their dad took that over in 1934.
And that's where your office is today.
And that's where the office is today. I was born there actually, and lived the first 7 or 8 years of my life there. And when Frank first got married, he lived there for a couple of years. It's all upstairs above the shop. And then when Adrian got married, he lived up there. So everybody had a turn living there. And yeah, so the office is back there now. We rebuilt the thing as an office. So it's a 3-level office now, and happily.
Yeah.
Yep.
So your parents are obviously remarkable people. So tell us a little bit about them, your childhood with your siblings, and how this sort of shaped you as a person.
Well, yeah, of course. Back in those days, it was a very much different business. It was a retail fruit shop. The residence was upstairs, and there were 8 of us all together: mum and dad, 5 boys and 1 girl, and we were all condensed into 3 bedrooms. Actually, Anthony and Kevin and myself were in 1 bed in the back room, and then the next room was Frank and Adrian, and then there was mum and dad and Sandra in the other room. So, and there were no corridors, so everybody just traipsed through everyone's bedrooms, getting from one end of the house to the other. So their privacy wasn't a big item.
No.
But that's we grew up together, and we fought and scrapped like siblings do, and we developed from there. And once, particularly Frank and Adrian were the 2 eldest, of course, once they took over the fruit shop from mum and dad, and then they started to expand into wholesaling, which of course back in those days was the local cafes and the hospital, and so the hospital was our customer way back in the 60s. And the business grew from there.
So you've learned everything there was to learn about food and produce from the ground up, literally from the ground up, and powered your way to the upper echelons of the nation's produce wholesale sector, and helped oversee a group with more than 7,000 employees and an annual turnover of about $1 billion. So was it always a given that you'll be in the family business?
No, it wasn't always a given. I actually was it wasn't too bad at school myself, and not so much by hard work, but I think I was just blessed with a bit of nous. But I actually came to the end of year 12, and I got which I was the first one in the family to actually do that. So education wasn't high on the list back in those days. It was a matter of earning an income. And when I came to the end of year 12, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I'd considered medicine, I'd considered law, I'd considered everything, and then
priesthood?
No, not quite. And when I couldn't make up my mind, that's when Dad said, well, if you can't make up your mind, well, I'll help you. Go and join your brothers.
Well,
so there I was.
Wasn't a bad call, I'd say. Now, the loss of your brother Frank from lung cancer this year is still very fresh in our minds, and he's certainly left a void in Geelong, not just because of his work and good deeds, but because of the high profile he had in this town. But you told a story of failure at his service. Can you recount that for us?
Yeah, I can. I think, I don't want to bore people with the same story twice, but as the business was growing and going back in the early 60s, or during the 60s, in 64, the first supermarket came to Geelong, which was a Coles supermarket in Belmont, which is now a Bilo. With the advent of the supermarkets, that changed the whole face of retailing altogether, actually, not just produce. But we realised that if we were going to be serious in this business, we needed to supply the supermarkets. So Adrian, particularly, was the front man to go and win that business, and which we did. And so there were really 2 major players in Geelong. There were ourselves and Watson & Co, who were actually a bigger business than us, based in Gordon Avenue. And anyway, in late 69, Frank and Adrian bought Watson & Co, took that business over. I was just leaving school. I was still 16 at the time. And they took the business on, and which in hindsight, turned out to be they just didn't have the capital base for to take on an acquisition of that size. Long story short, the business grew a lot faster than the management capacity could, and we got into all sorts of strife for cash flow, etc., etc. And I remember the time that Frank came back and said the bank manager had called Frank in, and just Reader's Digest version, and said to him, look, he said, you fellas, you boys have just bitten off a lot more than you can chew this time. So you've only got one option. you've either got to, sell the business or fold it, but you cannot continue trading. The bank will not back you. And so when Frank came back to see us all, we were all waiting for his return, from the bank. I think I was 19 at the time, by that time, and Frank recounted that, and so we sort of looked at him with an expectant tone as to, okay, you've told us the problem, what's the solution? And Frank just looked at us and said, we're just going to chew like buggery. And because the one thing, that's where Frank was such a great leader, because he just wouldn't quit. And he led from the front. So he led the way, and he spoke with all our creditors and got extended terms, and he spoke with a lot of friends. We got growers who were prepared to leave their money there till the next season, and he had other friends who actually lent him money in brown paper bags just to lump and said, take this and hang on to it for as long as you need it. And that's the level of trust that was engendered, and that was all done without any paperwork. It was just done on the handshake, and on the reputation of both Frank and Adrian as the two main players. But that's where Frank was such a great leader.
Yeah, just amazing. And tell us, I know you've told the story before, but staring down the mafia.
Well, in 1990, essentially, which we knew about it because we saw it from the sidelines. And when I say the sidelines, we were in the market, and we saw that there are a few different players that have taken a major role in servicing both Coles and Woolworths and in their new warehouses distribution centres that they both started to develop. And we just saw some really weird things happening with what sort of produce was being supplied and prices paid, etc. But anyway, Woolworths were the first ones to try and sort the mess out, and of course they were based headquartered in Sydney. But even though we weren't supplying Woolworths at the time, I remember they called on us, and I was talking with them about and giving them a lot of market data and prices and information and copies of invoices that we had, etc., and growers' returns to give them evidence to use themselves to clean up their end. And then in Melbourne, where Coles had struggled to try and sort the whole mess out as to what was going on, and they knew the rot was internal, but it was very difficult for them to put their hands on. So they actually came and asked us to, they called Frank up and asked us to come in and talk to them about taking over the whole supply and distribution for Victoria. So Frank and I went in there together, and we talked through. And one of the things that probably didn't relate is that it was that was on the, I can't remember, I think it was the Friday, I can't recall. And anyway, on the Monday morning, and when Anthony was called in, he was in the market, and one of these fellows that we knew was part of this whole cartel called around to see Anthony, and he told him, and this was a meeting, Frank and I went to this meeting, it was supposed to be super secret, it wasn't on Coles property, it was somewhere else. And anyway, he was able to tell us, who was at the meeting, who had coffee, who had tea, the whole, so we didn't know who was involved in this thing, but so anyway, he then put it to Anthony at the time that he said, look, you've obviously accepted the job and Coles have given it, and so we will we'll accept that, but what you need to do is you'll get our cooperation, and they offered us a 7-figure sum in cash every year, but all we had to do was buy from the growers that they directed us to buy it from. And the other option they put to Anthony at the time was very melodramatic, but if you understood the times, he pulled a bullet out of his pocket and sat it on the table in front of Anthony. He said, that's your other choice. So Anthony came back with that, and of course, all of us to a man were pretty incensed by it. Actually, And Frank, of course, took the lead and just went back and said, unconditionally, no, we don't want to negotiate with you fellas. You run your business, we'll run ours. Well, that's when they did start to get very nasty. The Coles state manager was answered the door at 11 p.m. to get 2 shotgun blasts, into his body. The man survived, but he was ruined for life. The warehouse manager was met in the car park night shifting with 2 fellas with baseball bats, and he got broken up very badly. And even our buyers, the buyers working for us, they received their wives received the phone call to tell them where their kids went to school, and they said if they didn't want anything to happen to their children, that their husbands had to resign from Costa's immediately. So we had all of this going on. So we had to actually put armed guards in their houses. Well, the wives would have really appreciated that. But I tell you what, our blokes wouldn't quit. They were incensed by the whole thing as well. So it was solidarity, and we also had some friends who sent back some very, if I can say, pointed messages back to the cartel. So I think we got the message across, and it took quite a while, but after a while it settled down and we could just get on with the business.
Have those characters disappeared now?
Oh no, they're still around. A couple of them died, of course. It's been a long time, but a couple are still around. A couple are in jail. It's amazing. They get around like they're just ordinary Joes, but there's some they're bad boys.
Amazing. Rob, as we said, Frank left a void, but I guess it's fair to say that equally the loss of your brothers, Anthony and Adrian, left a huge void as both brothers and business partners to you. And both of these deaths were sudden and unexpected. Adrian passed away in 1972. Can you tell us about Adrian and the circumstances of his passing?
Yeah, well, of course, at that time, and if you had to know the business back then, it was a lot smaller, of course. But Frank was the boss, but Adrian was the front of the business. Adrian's the one who dealt with the supermarkets, dealt with the growers, went to market, and he was, and Adrian had Frank had great charisma. Adrian he was the showman. But he was actually on his 10th honeymoon. Him and his wife Mary on their 10th honeymoon, and they were driving home from Canberra, and Mary was driving and lost control of the car, and anyway, it sort of aquaplaned sideways and straight into an oncoming car coming the other way, and so they were both killed, and the 2 people in the front of the other car were killed as well. So it was a very savage accident and a big shock, because that was right in the middle of the time we were having all that trouble with the bank. Just before the whole business about biting off more than you could chew. So we were really under a lot of stress at the time, and losing Adrian like that just compounded the whole situation so much worse.
How old was Adrian and Mary?
He's 32.
Yeah, awful. Yeah. And then in February 2017, so only a few years ago, your brother Anthony lost his life. Can you tell us a little bit?
Well, Anthony went he'd gone into hospital to get a double knee reconstruction, something he should have done 25 years earlier. But he finally went in to do it, and he did it on the Tuesday, on the Wednesday, and I spoke to him on the phone in the morning. Other people went to visit him. I hadn't been to see him, but he was sitting up. He was feeling really good, the whole thing. And anyway, on the Wednesday, late Wednesday afternoon, he got hit with a stroke, and the thing just got worse. He was up at John of God. They rushed him down to Barwon Health, but even they didn't have the facility, so he had to get up to the Royal Melbourne. So they did that as quickly as they could, but by the time he got to Royal Melbourne, it was all too late, and he passed away a few days later.
It's tragic. So, Rob, in 2011, at the same time as forming Costa Asset Management, you and Anthony, together with your families, Anthony's wife Elaine and your wife Rita, founded a charitable foundation as a legacy to your forebears, and then an appreciation of the community in which you lived. And then following Anthony's passing, the family's resolved to name that foundation in his honour, thus becoming the Anthony Costa Foundation. And
That's
you and
correct.
your board nominated three key areas of focus: ensuring equity in education, improving community health and wellbeing, and building vibrant and fair communities, and mainly centred on causes in our region. You're also on the inaugural board of the Barwon Health Future Fund, now the Barwon Health Foundation. Can you explain both your own and your family's relationship with Geelong and the importance of these areas to you and the Anthony Costa Foundation?
Well, Francis, I probably would consider. The cost as you regale the cost splendidly in your opening, but I would say we're probably Geelong's greatest spectators, because we're all useless at sport. We're useless at any kind of talent as far as the arts community is concerned. We were no good at any of the professions, whether it was medicine or anything else. So we decided our best role would be the cheer squad for everything we could be. But no, seriously, I know the business grew well beyond Geelong, of course, just because of the size of it. But it was Geelong where our roots are. It was Geelong that gave us the start. We were supported by the people of Geelong, going right back to the retail fruit shop days and beyond. And it's Geelong where we were all raised and educated, our children, our grandchildren. And and I mentioned that I think it was only yesterday that we find it a unique place, or I certainly do, in that it's big enough to have fabulous health services, education, sporting facilities. You look at the geographical splendour we have with the beaches, the country at your back door, the whole deal. We're only an hour from Melbourne, yet we're big enough to have all that, but we're small enough to be a community where people know each other, and you really feel a sense of belonging. And this is the thing I feel very strongly about, is that people need to belong. They want to belong, and this is what Geelong does so well. It's a real identity. Whereas you can get lost in the very big cities, but here you can still have your identity as a Geelong person.
Yeah. And
it just does so many wonderful things. Well, it certainly has for our family. So I think it's some say putting back. I think it's probably repaying. It's probably a better title, a debt that's owed. So and it's just a pleasure to be able to still be part of things and contribute how you can and where you can. And that's the thing that makes it so wonderful for everybody in this town. I mean, and recognising that there are elements of the town that struggle. So, and this is one of the things where the foundation, but also Give Where You Live, Geelong Community Foundation, and we have a great relationship with all of them. And I think that's one of the great things we do in Geelong too, is you get foundations that work together, to be able to do things that no one of us could do on our own. So you can do things as a combined effort. And everybody, there's not a sense of competition. It's just, how do we get this job done the best way we can get it done?
Yeah. Well, very generous and typically so humble of you, Robert. Now, your family has seen its severe share of health issues over the journey. Your brother Anthony, we were just discussing, and your brother Kevin, having two sons, your nephews Matthew and Richard, who both fought a very brave fight against the debilitating disease of muscular dystrophy, which essentially causes a slow paralysis. And tragically, having both been confined to wheelchairs since they were just 10 years of age, both succumbed to that when they were still in their 20s. But there have been other health issues, and you yourself have needed support of the health service before. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, well, probably I'd say my biggest issue was, a while ago now, back in 2003, was I had diagnosed with bowel cancer, and I was in a very bad way. They actually said that I was about 3 weeks from my organs shutting down. So I was fortunate that they were able to put Humpty back together again. But then, of course, more recently, like 12 months ago, I contracted coronavirus, which saw me in Barwon Health in the acute ward there, so I was in there for 8 days, and thank goodness to wonderful experience and very caring people, and again they got me back on my feet and back out again. So yeah, we've all had, and the whole family's had a share of health issues. The only one who hadn't was Frank. Frank had gone his whole life and never had a sick day, and never smoked, never drank, and he gets hit with lung cancer. So maybe Paul can explain that bit, because I don't understand it. But anyway, that's how it goes.
I wanted to talk about bees and the importance of bees, but I think we're running out of time, so we might have to do that another time.
Right.
But so not just through the Anthony Costa Foundation, but the whole Costa family have contributed to make the Adrian Costa Clinical Trials Centre become a reality. So why was that project so important to you and the family?
I think on a couple of fronts. One was, having dealt with health issues ourselves, in the family, and there's my sister as well, and she passed away just before Christmas. So having seen all this, and then looking today, and going right back to my parents too, and they both succumbed to ailments, before their time. So it's understanding the importance of research, but also once I'd through my involvement with Barwon Health Foundation, to come to the realisation that we had such a talent pool in Geelong, yet it was disparate. It was happening wherever they could fit it in, and here and there, and the different operators. So the prospect of being able to bring all of that, that talent pool and knowledge together in one place was just, to me, I thought, the greatest opportunity before us in Geelong. So we kicked it around as a family, and we really just agreed that this is such an important thing. We needed to get behind it to be able to get started and get up. So it was thrilling, both from a health point of view, but also to know we had this in Geelong, in our own hometown. This sort of capacity that I previously thought of, was sort of, coming out of, America or Europe or wherever. But our own hometown was right at the pointy end.
And Robert, you also wanted it to inspire philanthropy.
I do. I think, look, as you said, it comes a point, people will at some point have to decide on what they're going to do with their legacy. And I don't think there's anything greater than leaving a legacy that is a boon to the ensuing generations, something that's there forever. And we're very fortunate to have Barwon Health in Geelong. I mean, we've got, as I said, such great health facilities. But for those of us a bit older, we cast our mind back, to the earlier days and the old Gala Day parades and the whole thing. But Barwon Health has been such an essential part of the community, and I'm sure every family somewhere would have had some kind of involvement with Barwon Health and be thankful to it. So yeah, I can only commend to people that if you're considering your will and a bequest, that if you want to get real value for your money that you're leaving behind, and know that it won't be wasted, and there will be other families who otherwise couldn't afford it, who will be beneficiaries of the legacy that you leave behind. It's just something special we have here in Geelong.
Absolutely. And either that, a donation right now too. So if anyone does want to have a look a bit more about the Adrian Costa Clinical Trials Centre and how they can support it, please get in touch. Robert, you said at your brother Frank's funeral that your brother was a philanthropist, but the modern day usage of the word has become mangled to be meaning a lot of rich people writing cheques. You explained the meaning at its root is the love of humanity and the giving of time, energy and self to your fellow man. They really were beautiful words to speak of your brother, but I think they apply identically to you. You are truly one of Geelong's finest, and we thank you sincerely for your extraordinary, humble commitment, your contribution to Geelong, and the inspiration you provide to others to support so much in the region. Thanks very much for your time today, Robert Costa.
Thank you.
Now we turn our attention to Paul Lightfoot, who, like us all, is very grateful for the Costa's vision and generosity. Paul Lightfoot joined Barwon Health as Director of the Adrian Costa Clinical Trials Centre only in January this year, but he's a dynamo and he's already achieving extraordinary things before the doors of the centre have even officially opened. Paul's career in clinical trials extend over 25 years, both in regional and metropolitan hospitals in Australia and the UK. He contributed to the establishment and development of the clinical trials unit within the world-leading epilepsy program at Wightons Health, and was part of the organisation's restructuring of the medical and cognitive research unit. Paul has many roots in the region after growing up on a sheep farm in the Western District where his parents still live, and you can see if he pumps up his chest, he's actually wearing a Geelong Football Club badge there. So please give a big virtual welcome to Paul Lightfoot.
Thanks very much there, Francis. And the badge is actually, as I mentioned, I bought that on the way into the 2007 grand final at MCG, which remains the only grand final I've been to. And I don't think I'll go to any others because I doubt I could top that in any way, shape or form. It was frankly one of the best days of my entire life. Maybe even better than my wedding, but I won't. Hopefully we'll just keep that between us. It'll be fine.
That's very dangerous territory there, Paul.
Yeah, extremely dangerous.
Now, so just to simply sort of find out, what is the Adrian Costa Clinical Trials Centre?
So it's a new centre at Barwon Health, which will establish both a facility and a service to support clinical trials across Geelong, the Greater Barwon region and the Greater Southwestern Victorian region, in a short sort of one sentence sort of answer.
And what are the areas of medicine to be covered in the Clinical Trials Research Centre? And can you give us some examples of current trials?
Yeah. So we're not limiting ourselves to any particular areas. The Costa Centre, if someone has a good idea, then we want to support it regardless of what area of medicine it comes from, or allied health or anything like that. Anything that will contribute to people's health in the Greater Geelong region is something we will look at and figure out if we can support it in any way, shape or form, if it's a good idea. So in terms of actual trials that we're setting up at the moment, we've got 13 commercially sponsored trials in startup, 2 ready to recruit now, 3 are in the process of application approval, and 8 are accepted and in final budget negotiations. There are also initial approaches for 9 other studies, and there are 7 non-commercial clinical trials in startup or actually recruiting and running now. And that's just the ones inside the Costa Centre. That's not outside the Costa Centre being supported as part of the greater parts of other trials that are going on at Barwon Health at the moment.
That figure was around 200 trials, all right?
So Greater Barwon Health in 2020, which is the last time that I've got figures for, there are around 200 clinical trials at Barwon Health. And just to show how that compares, the Royal Melbourne over the same period of time had 174 clinical trials. So that's a real credit for a regional centre and really shows that we're sort of punching above our weight in a lot of ways, which is a marvellous thing. And just shows what strength that Barwon Health has in terms of existing groups as well that really need as much support as possible, not just new trials and new areas, but existing groups such as mental health and cancer trials and vaccine trials and cardiology trials. They're all fantastic groups that need as much support as possible, which is part of what the Costa Centre will be doing.
So they'll all come under the umbrella of the Adrian Costa Clinical Trials Centre.
Yeah, to a greater or lesser degree. We in no way want to make cramp the style of any of the existing groups. But yes, we will be providing support and oversight for most of the clinical trials groups. Yep.
And it's virtually covering off virtually every area of medicine.
Yeah, exactly. As I said, we're not going to limit ourselves to any particular area. There are areas of unmet need. So there are areas where there hasn't been a lot of trials happening previously. So we're keen to establish and get them up and going. So there hasn't been a lot of gastroenterology trials for a while in the Greater Geelong region. But of those trials that I mentioned, 6 of them are gastroenterology trials. And so we've got a group already almost up and going for that, which will spin out into a smaller subunit and team to focus on gastroenterology trials in the future. We'd also like to get more into which hasn't quite happened yet, but I'm sure we will get it into things like treatments for Alzheimer's. With an ageing population, I think that'd be a marvellous area for us to get into, rather than people having to go to Melbourne for greater treatments.
Right. And there's a study in autism at the moment?
Yeah, so we're recruiting for that right at the moment. So this particular study, if I have a little look at my notes, it's a study using the old migraine drug called Zomig to treat agitation and irritability in teenagers and young adults with autism. The people who are taking part would be these people with autism. We'd establish a bunch of baseline tests for them, give them this new drug and see if it treats it, then bring them back and assess them again. It's an interesting drug in that it's been previously used for migraines, so it's already quite safe. People can buy it over the counter. It's never been used in kids with autism because the formulation was very short acting. So if you want something that's going to treat irritability and agitation, you want it to last, say, 24 hours a day. But there's a new formulation, and that's what we're trying. And it hasn't actually been used in kids with autism before. Another advantage of all that is that the testing that's involved in the clinical trial really helps the parents and caregivers of the kids with autism to get proper assessments that aren't normally available to them. So they'll be able to do things like get in IQ testing and a bunch of other tests that they're required to have in order to qualify for NDIS funding. So this trial will help them get that sort of funding in the future. So it's a lovely synergy of things to help out people with autism in the Geelong community. And for whatever reason, there is double the normal rate or the normal prevalence of autism in Australia in the Greater Geelong area. So it's an area of real need. So yeah, we're very interested in progressing that as much as possible. This also plugs into the incredible strength that the Geelong region has in its mental health researchers. It's an area where we're absolutely Australia leading and in some cases world leading. So it's fantastic.
And speaking of mental health, there's another trial, I understand, with involving ophthalmology.
Oh yeah, this is cool. So we've got this commercial trial from a group that originally started doing this study in Canada, but now it's translating over to here. And it's essentially an eye test, which will be able to allow psychiatrists to differentiate between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. So rather than go through all these extended long tests that often take years to come about, you'll be able to do a sort of eye test, which will look at particular parts of the back of the eye, which are different between people with bipolar disorder and people with schizophrenia. So it's a really interesting study. And it's an example of a non-drug trial, which can be quite useful and helpful for people.
Paul, would you have any figures on the number of participants that are currently involved in trials? Is it tens,
Yeah.
Is it hundreds, what is it?
So just going back to those figures from 2020, around about 2,500 people volunteered to take part in clinical trials across the Greater Barwon Health region. And that's overrepresented compared to other parts of Australia. So there's a greater percentage of people in the Barwon region that volunteer to take part in clinical trials, both just as healthy volunteers and people who need treatment. So that's another example of the strength of the Geelong community and them being part of the whole thing. And something that we in the Costa Centre want to do is we want to get community groups involved right from the start of trial design and have them on board. That autism study I mentioned earlier on, we deliberately went out and consulted people who are part of autism support groups in Geelong, and they had feedback into the design of the actual trial. They were able to say, well, we think this will work, this won't work. And then that was fed back to the people who are sponsoring the trial, and they changed the way the trial is run based on that feedback to make it something which is more attractive and more likely to be successful. And we think that's a fantastic model compared to the old days where people would just be presented with a particular trial. That's it. If you don't fit the criteria, bad luck. So yeah, that's an example of community feedback from Geelong, which is an advantage.
And Paul, what are the aspirations of the centre? What do you hope to achieve in the short and the longer term?
Yeah, so in short term, like the next 6 months, we want to polish off the construction renovation / of the centre and get that all open up and shiny and new. We did have a goal of, say, 10 clinical trials in the next 6 months, but we're ahead of that. We then have another goal of 20 trials in the next 12 months and 50 trials in the next 24 months. Longer term, we want to establish the Costa Centre as a nationally recognised research centre that people are attracted to and come into as local researchers, and even attract people from overseas to come and work at. That would be a fantastic thing. We also want to attract all the ancillary sort of things that go around it. We'd like to establish, say, early phase units attached to the area as well. So like for the units that do healthy volunteer testing of very early stage drugs, that's a area which Australia has a particular strength in, and we'd like to establish that in Geelong. We'd also like to establish, say, drug manufacturing in the area as well. We think that's a marvellous way of growing the community and support for clinical trials and health in the region, but also growing industry in Geelong as well. So we think that's vital to try and attract those sort of people as well.
So the centre, it's a transitional opening. So you've got something going on there at the moment, but eventually fully open.
Yeah, we're all, if it wasn't for the lockdown, we would already be seeing patients sort of in the temporary area that Barwon has allocated us, which is just an existing ward, which we've basically just done a quick spruce up to allow us to see people right away. So if it wasn't for lockdown, we would be already seeing patients in trials. So that will be a temporary arrangement until the renovations and all that are done, but we'll work around it because I've done stuff like this before, where you just put hoardings up in one area, you see patients in the other bit, and you keep seeing patients while the construction and renovation is going on as much as possible. This really helps establish a revenue stream and makes the centre financially viable as well. It's very important.
So, I mean, you've talked about international, so I'm assuming the centre is not just for Geelong, it's for a wider area.
No. So, for example, that autism study, again, I know I'm allowed to talk about this one because we're past the point of confidentiality. We're in the recruitment stage. So I can't talk in great detail about other studies. So excuse me for going back to that same study again. But we will be the first centre in the world that starts this study. The way that often these things work is you need to have an initial centre that establishes an initial cohort. So we'll be recruiting 10 adults initially, and they'll be the first people who take part in the trial worldwide. And once we've had a look at how the trial goes with those first 10, then the trial will be set up at other areas in Australia, and then it will go off to America and Europe.
Right, okay. So it's not just for new drugs. Just tell us about that part of it.
Yeah. Well, obviously, that one I was talking about with the eye test, that's not a new drug at all. That's using a method of diagnosis which has not previously been used for a different method. But it's an intervention which can affect people's health, which is what effectively clinical trials are. Novel interventions that can help people. Another example of something we're doing at the moment is we're doing a bowel cancer screening study. So obviously screening for bowel cancer is not a drug, but it's a clinical trial where we've worked in collaboration with the local Rotary to set up a bowel cancer screening pilot for people under 50 years of age, with the ultimate aim that it ends up being something that informs government policy to allow bowel cancer screening for people under 50 years of age.
Right. I remember a few years back, the foundation funded a PhD scholarship under Michael Burke, and it was an investigation into a tropical fruit called mangosteen and its effect potentially on patients with positive effect on patients with bipolar and schizophrenia. Can you talk us through how an idea actually then comes to be a clinical trial? What are the sort of steps that they've got to go through?
Yeah, so obviously someone has an idea first up. Depends on what the idea often as to where they go. But say something like that, then they would potentially go to a funder, a sponsor of some description, and that could be government, it could be philanthropy, it could be a commercial sponsor. They say, I've got this particular idea, and then they have to write protocols around it, develop the idea further, get it reviewed by peers to make sure that it's scientifically rigorous. And then once they've got the idea formulated completely, they then take that idea and submit it to ethical review under established and certified ethics committees to make sure that they're not doing something that's completely wrong and out there. because there have been past history, like in the early part of the 20th century, where there was some quite dodgy clinical trials going on. So once they've got ethical approval and they've got all that and they've got funding for it, then they go ahead and start the clinical trial by recruiting people, publishing the results, and hopefully it ends up with an outcome such as a new drug or something like that. Then that's only the start. Once they've got that part done and they've shown that it might do something, they publish that, and then people get to have another go at it. And then you have to do something called repeatability. So that result, that scientific result of their experiment, if you like, has to be repeated by other people to make sure it wasn't a fluke or something a bit out there. So it's an extremely rigorous and cautious process that's constantly double-checked and audited all the way through, which is probably why it takes so long a lot of the time. And you constantly hear news articles saying, in 5 years' time, this could be a treatment, that sort of stuff. But that's part of the process and how it goes. And someone has a basic idea on, say, a new drug, for example, maybe only 1 in 10 of those will get to any later stage of development. So there's a high failure rate.
And the support that we need, I mean, the Costas have done an amazing job in the establishment of the centre, but the centre requires ongoing support for seed funding, equipment, consumables, staff. Is that the area?
Yeah, absolutely. Anything like that helps us grow it, and it's a multiplier effect as well. So the fantastic and very generous donation we've got from the Costas so far that has allowed us to seed this up multiplies greatly. All those trials I've been talking about, they attract their own funding, and then that allows us to fund other ideas as we go along. So there was a report produced by the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance that came out about 3 months ago. So the multiplier effect in terms of money put into clinical trials is about 6.7 in what comes out of it. So it's a very high multiplier effect. So every dollar that gets put in results in $6.70 going back into the community and producing further research.
So, of course, if anyone wants to assist and support the centre, they can get in contact with the foundation. We'd be really happy to hear from you. But if you're interested in actually being part of a trial, how does that work?
So they can contact us or go to the Barwon Health website. There is a volunteer section in the Barwon Health website up in the top part of the bar there. You can click on that. People are always welcome, even just to register an interest in taking part in a future clinical trial. If they particularly want to contact us, they can just email me on the website, which is ACCTC, Adrian Costa Clinical Trial Centre, at barwonhealth.org.au. So that's ACCTC at barwonhealth, all one word, .org.au.
Our timing is impeccable, gents, so I thank you for that. We're just about to tick over to 3 o'clock. So thank you, Paul, for that. We're so lucky to have you leading such an important area of the health service. And as you said, it's a place which can give people hope where previously there may have been none. It also retains the brightest minds in Geelong. And Robert, again, thank you for the extraordinary contribution you've made and continue to make for the advancement of Geelong. In the final week of our Legacy webinars, next Thursday, the 29th, we'll be speaking to the retiring CEO of the Geelong Football Club, Chair of Barwon Health, Brian Cook, together with the Senior Staff Specialist of the Emergency Department at University Hospital Geelong, Dr. Julian Stella. So we look forward to those, and I'll send everyone a link to each. So thanks again for joining us. Mask up, get vaccinated if you're eligible, and stay healthy. Enjoy the rest of the day, and may we all soon be out of lockdown. Bye for now. So I'm joined by Justine Finlay, Managing Director of Wightons Lawyers in Geelong. Welcome along, Justine.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, how are you coping with your work during the cumulative 6 months of lockdown? I assume you've been doing a lot of Zooming?
Yeah, it's been challenging, challenging for staff in and out of the office, but we are managing as everyone else is.
So in this digital age, how safe and how legal are digital signatures inserted in documents? Is it safe, or is there a need for new technology or new ideas around that?
Look, it is safe in certain documents. Certainly, contracts for real estate have become digital, and there's platforms that have been set up by various companies to ensure that that is quite safe. Our preference with wills and powers of attorney is that they are signed physically signed documents. There's been some allowance for remote signing of those types of documents, but certainly our preference would be to have that as an original document.
Yeah. Well, Justine, as you know, this month we've been talking all about legacy, and there's an amazing statistic. I'm not sure how accurate, you might be able to verify it, but almost 60% of Australian adults don't have a will, which is really so alarming. So why do you think that figure is so high? And what are the repercussions if you don't have a will?
So, I'm not surprised at that statistic, given the number of people we see coming in their 40s, 50s and 60s who've never had a will before. I think that for some people it's accepting mortality. So the minute they actually make a will, they're accepting that they will die at some point. But unfortunately, that happens to the best of us. Maybe cost, maybe just the thought of having to get out and get it done, but it's actually not that difficult. Certainly from our perspective, most of the information that people need to make their will, they have on hand. It's in their head, or at worst case, we can talk to their accountants, we can talk to financial planners to get that information. But why is it important to have a will? Look, it's important so that your wishes are carried out as much as possible, that you have the opportunity to appoint who you want to manage your affairs when you've passed away, and that your assets are passing where you want them to pass in the most effective manner.
Yeah. And what are the repercussions if you don't have a will?
So if you don't have a will, then there is legislation in Victoria that governs where your assets pass and who can be appointed. Now, that may not be where you would want that to go. It's pretty much family tree. So linear type descendancies, spouse, children, and then out further. But definitely when people are in second marriages, children from different relationships, it becomes really, really messy and probably not what you would want.
No. And what age do you think we should be making our first will? And when and how often should they be reviewed?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question. I think once you've actually got assets, it's important to have a will. Or when you have children, it's important to have a will. Look, I've got clients of mine who are parents who will be bringing their children in when they're in their early 20s to get their wills done, and that's just forward planning. But certainly once you start working, you'll have superannuation. Once you buy a house, you'll have an asset. Once you have children, it's really important to get your will done. And look, I'd be suggesting that you at least revisit your will every 5 years, and definitely be talking to your lawyer every sort of 10 years, but at least revisit, have a look at what you've got in there and see whether anything's changed. And
so speaking of lawyers and the process, the role of an executor can be a complex one. Is it necessary to choose someone with a certain skill set, or is it more important to have a trusted person known to you, like a family member, and knowing that a lot of the fine points and legalities will be taken care of by a lawyer anyway? Yeah, look, probably the latter, depending upon your estate. My advice would always be make sure that it's someone that you have complete trust in to take on that role. It's a really important role, but it does be someone who has any qualifications. Remembering that there are lawyers, there are accountants, there are financial planners who will be able to help and assist with whatever needs to be done in relation to your estate. And my preference would be, as long as everyone gets along in the family, that it is a family member who is also a beneficiary who's looking after the estate. But every family is a little bit different, so it's working through what's best for your family. Right. Now, I know this is your area of expertise, Justine, but I was reading somewhere recently where I think it was a Gold Coast guy was engaged by people who were knocking on death's door to go to their funerals or gravesides and reveal the secrets they want their loved ones to know. Now, I certainly wouldn't recommend that to anyone, but do you sometimes see, apart from choosing who they may include or who they may exclude in a will, yes, what people wanting to pass on messages from the grave, as it were, in their wills? Look, not as much. We certainly have people wanting other letters and the like kept with their wills. We try and keep the wills to the necessities that need to be done. But I have seen some strange things happen and some strange wishes, particularly perhaps around what people want, in relation to funerals and those sorts of things.
it's an opportunity to put that out there if that's where you want it to be, but maybe not in your will, depending on what it is.
Fair enough. Now, apart from a will, what are some of the other important things we should have documented?
So probably the other things that I'd be suggesting if you're looking at that type of planning is your powers of attorney. So a financial power of attorney, an appointment of a medical decision maker for you, and a personal power of attorney. And it's also really important to have a look at your superannuation as to whether you should be doing binding nominations. And, close to Barwon Health's heart are advanced care plan directives.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Justine. Thanks for your support of Barwon Health Foundation and Legacy Month.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.